A few videos back, I made this. It's a fantastic camera stand that makes it super easy to raise and lower cameras and lights, and it holds a bunch of stuff, and it's awesome. And it definitely makes it faster and easier to make videos. But it's not like 100% awesome, it's like 75% awesome. Now, I don't normally do version 2 videos or updates about old projects. I like to move on, but I think this one's kind of special, and it's got potential to actually be useful to a lot of other video creators, and I think we can get it at least closer to 100% awesome. So before we can make improvements to it, we have to talk about what the problems are. But before we talk about the problems, we can talk about the things that it does very well. The intention on this was to be able to add cameras and lights to this, move it up and down, plus roll the entire thing around the shop to get more varied shots more easily. And it absolutely does that well. I mean, I can roll it around the shop and I can adjust the camera anywhere that I want. Plus, I can move it up and down, and I don't even have to lock it, although there is a lock on it. And on top of that, I've got a tray down here with extra batteries and batteries on chargers that are on a battery backup, plus extra cameras. I mean, I've got everything I need down here to film a video. So, what are the problems? Well, none of them are huge things, but they add up together, and I think they're all things that we can at least improve. The first one is wobbliness. Now, to be fair, I made this thing for static shots. It's not really made to be able to do moving shots, although you can. But the problem is that anytime you make an adjustment to it, it does this. It wobbles. This thing has a lot of weight on the top of it, so naturally it's gonna move a little bit. But I don't think the top is actually the problem. I think the problem is the connection at the bottom. There's two things down here that I think are compounding to be the big problem. The first one is the casters. Casters are wheels. They roll. They've got bearings with slop. They're gonna move a little bit. But the other thing is actually this connection right here. This is an aluminum extrusion in a steel bracket bolted to a piece of plywood. And of those three things, I think the plywood is definitely gonna have the most flex to it. But since we're down here, we've got a couple more problems. One, we're wasting a whole lot of space using these pavers just because we need the weight for stability. But on top of that, this tray doesn't have a top, so it's filling up with sawdust. Now, neither one of those are that big of a deal. I mean, they're inconvenient, but they're not really a problem. But the last one actually almost ruined my camera, and it's this. When I was working on the counterweight portion of this, I was really not thinking, and I was just using something that was the right weight to counterbalance the camera. And I found this big chunk of steel. But unfortunately, it sticks off really far in both directions, and this corner has almost destroyed my camera. More than once, I've had the camera face this direction, either the lens or the flip out screen, and I've gone to move them past each other, and I run into that. The counterweight hits part of the camera, and that is bad. So in version 2, we've got three big things that we want to improve. Less wobble, better storage, and less chance of destroying the camera. And to get started, I'm gonna move this camera onto that thing because it's way easier than using this tripod. To get started on this, I really wanted to start at the ground up, literally, at the casters, and work my way up to try to make it as stable as possible. Luckily, I've had this universal mobile base kit floating around my shop for literally like 6 or 7 years, and I've never used it on anything. The cool thing about these is that they have casters, but the casters are retractable, so you can actually set the entire thing directly on the ground so it can't roll when you want it to be in place. There are several companies who make mobile bases very similar to this. In fact, I've got a few different kinds in my shop. This just happens to be one that's been floating around here unused for a long time, so we're gonna use it. And since I had this thing on hand, I went ahead and measured it and then took those measurements into Fusion to start actually designing the entire thing with this base as the base. So in Fusion, I modeled up the mobile base, I modeled up these brackets and the little kind of toolbox covered area that's gonna go on top, and I'm gonna have to make that in just a little bit. But first, we gotta talk about the new base because it's honestly probably gonna be the biggest change. Instead of having a plywood base that you have to add stones to make it heavy, I figured why not do it all as one piece. This is a plate that I designed in Fusion and then sent out to today's sponsor, Send Cut Send, because they can make basically anything. And the reason I use Send Cut Send is because this is a sheet of 1/2-inch steel that's got all the holes drilled in the right place, and it's powder coated. I've used Send Cut Send several times for lots of different projects, and it's amazing because not only do they have design services, but if you're like me and you can design your own parts, you just send them a file and then they make the thing and ship it to you, whether you need 1 or 100 or 1,000, I guess. I don't know. I don't think they have any limits. And they do lots of different stuff. CNC routing on wood and plastic. I usually use them for metalworking because they can laser cut and water jet 1/2-inch steel, plus put all the holes and bends that you need, as well as all sorts of finishing. Coating, powder coating, tumbling, all sorts of stuff. I'll put a link to them down in the description. You should definitely go check them out because, like I said, they can make you one piece or as many as you need and ship them directly to you. It's very cool. I should also point out that they throw candy into your orders, so that's pretty cool. But let me show you the piece. That's really cool. So I ordered the powder coating with like a hammered finish to it, and it looks really awesome. Oh, it's also very heavy. But the test is to see if I actually measured right. Well, that's perfect. Before I ordered this thing, I did a little basic math because I wanted to make sure that a steel sheet would be heavy enough to be a stable base. And it turns out that it's actually a little bit heavier than all the concrete I had before. So it's definitely gonna take up less room and be probably a little bit more stable. So let's just get it all bolted up and make sure it works. Well, that was easy. Thanks, SendCutSend, because that thing is pretty legit. It moves really smoothly, it's nice and heavy, and it stays in place when you lift the wheels. So that's pretty fantastic. But now we need to put the vertical on it to make sure that the wobble actually improves a little bit. I got almost the same extrusion as last time, but this one's a little bit better. Last time I got 3-foot sections of extrusion and joined them together, and it worked fine. But this time I got really long ones. Now, I don't think the joints that I added to the extrusion before actually caused any of the wobbliness. It seems pretty stable, but I'm just trying to get rid of all of it, so I figured a single piece should be a little bit stronger. The new base is awesome, and it rolls around super well, way better than this old one. I think these casters are just better. But also the drop-down caster thing is super cool. There's one slight adjustment we can make to make it even easier to use though. It's not actually a problem, but you do have to handle both of these individually to get it to drop down onto the feet, unless you add a bar. The base is way better. It's more stable and more mobile, which is pretty fantastic. So I'm saying that that one's pretty much checked off, but we still have a pretty big problem here. The pole itself just wants to wobble. I've looked into some different ways that people try to stiffen up the extrusion, especially when they're using a CNC router or a 3D printer that's going really fast. That's when the wobbles seem to matter. And people have tried lots of different stuff, including filling up those extrusions with lots of different things. I've learned that it's not useful to put anything that's porous on the inside of these because it doesn't actually stop anything from moving. Imagine you filled it up with sand. It would be more dense, but each one of those grains can still move against each other and it's not actually gonna stop the wobble. So some people end up mixing sand with epoxy to fill up the volume, and that's an option. You could also use concrete. That is also a pretty good option, and it would help with the weight of the whole thing. But I'm gonna try something that's even easier. Because I'm a little bit lazy, I was looking for something that I could actually just hammer in from one end all the way to the other just to fill the void with something that's strong. A piece of steel would be the best way to do this, but getting a piece of steel that would exactly fit on the inside of that is actually harder than you would think. Now, of course, you could take a 76-inch long piece of steel and mill it down to the right side on both dimensions and then hammer it down in there, or you could just get a really hard piece of wood and see if that does basically the same thing. This is a piece of hickory, and the reason I have it is because it's so hard that I haven't been able to cut it for projects in the past, but I've got a relatively new blade, so we're gonna give it a shot. And that's pretty crazy. That had so much tension in the piece of wood that as soon as I cut this strip off, it bent in wacky ways. Now, normally this would be a problem, but it actually might help. Normally you would want pieces of wood to be straight if you're using them. But in this case, I'm gonna do my best to hammer this down through the center of the extrusion. And so those curves and bends actually might make it tighter, or they'll make it impossible to do. Let's find out. Okay, the problem with this is that I'm using one piece of wood. It's a long, thin, bendy thing, and when you hit one end, most of that power doesn't actually transfer all the way down. It just gets wobbled out of the wood. So I'm gonna try to cut it into two pieces and hammer those in. I think that'll work. I don't know, maybe not. So for the second piece, I put it in from the bottom side, which made a lot more sense, and I trimmed down the wood just a little bit. It was way easier to go in, but still tight. Okay, moment of truth. It's still gonna move. I mean, I'm not gonna be able to get it to completely stop, but it does dampen faster than it did before, and it doesn't have any weight on it. I just did a test with the old version, and the movement on it is much bigger, but it doesn't last as long. This is smaller, and it kind of keeps going for a while. So I think once we add some weight to the top of this, it might be better. I don't really know. Now, all of that stuff was basically the same as the first version. I really didn't change anything. I did make this piece a little bit shorter just to see if that will help stop some of the wobble. But before I connect these two things together, I've got to figure out the counterweight side because that has to change. Like I mentioned before, I wanted to change this side so that nothing on the counterweight side would run into anything on the camera side. And so we're going to change how the weight is done here. Instead of having a crossbar that hangs stuff, we're just gonna take a big piece of steel and put it directly to this plate right here so it doesn't stick out on either side. But to do that, I have to take this really heavy piece of steel and attach it directly to the plate. So I think the best thing would be to drill and tap some holes so I can just screw them together. Now, obviously I don't have any weight on this, so it's not gonna be balanced, but I can go ahead and add the brake to this so that I can get it into a position and lock it in place. Now, last time I did this kind of complicated brake that's on the side because of how I put it together, and this time I don't have to do any of that. This time I can take one of these handles and screw it right into a threaded nut right there and put the lock directly under the bar, except for one problem. The bolt on this is way too long. It needs to stop right there, but if I were to go all the way in, it goes that far. So I'm gonna teach you a little trick to cut off a bolt and still use it. If you need to cut off a bolt, you can use a hacksaw or a cutoff wheel and a grinder and just cut it. The problem with that is that it messes up your starting thread. So after you cut it, you have a really hard time screwing something onto it. So what you do is add a nut to the bolt and then back it up past where you're gonna cut it off. Then you go ahead and cut it off as straight as you can and try not to mess up the threads at all. But if you do, it's not a big deal. You can unscrew this nut and it will help kind of reset that last thread as it's coming off, which will make it easier for it to go on. I don't know if this works every time, but it's worked every time for me. Okay, let's see if it goes back on well. Now you know. and knowing is half the battle.
G.I. Joe!
Now this thing's ready for a camera, really. So I've got basically the same setup as I had on the version 1. I'm gonna mount that right here, but instead of duplicating that right here for a light, I've actually got a different plan, and it has to do with adding power. So in version 1, I put all of the charged batteries, all of the dead batteries, and the chargers for my camera, my monitor, and my microphones all in the base of the stand so that I had them all with me at all time. They were all plugged into this battery backup so they would constantly be charging, and then this could be plugged into the wall to kind of replenish it. But I kind of don't need to do all that. I mean, the fact of the matter is, my shop's not that big. I could put all of those chargers and batteries in a cabinet right there that I could just as easily get to, but I kind of don't even need them because honestly, I could plug the camera and the monitor directly into this thing and mount it right here. So theoretically, I could take 2 USB cables, run them from these ports directly into the camera and the monitor and keep them charged all day long. I could either take this somewhere to charge it or just plug in a cable, plug it into the wall. It's also got the added benefit of being kind of heavy, so putting it here is gonna help counterbalance some of this, which should theoretically dampen some of that. But we're not gonna just duct tape it in place. It needs some sort of a holder so we can take it in and out to charge it or use it in other places. So, to Fusion. Some simple modeling, some quick 3D printing, and now I've got a cool little box to put the battery in. So I got the battery in there, put the camera on, and I figured, hey, I'll go ahead and test it out and see how much better the wobble is. And I think it's worse. I wanted to do a little test to see if this one would dampen itself. It stopped moving before the old version, so I set them up next to each other and kind of smacked them both. And I think they went the exact same amount of time, or the new one went just a little bit longer. Now the wobble in this thing is one of the really big things that I wanted to improve. So if it's gotten worse, we have a serious problem. Obviously cramming dowels down the middle of the pole didn't work. Putting it on a heavier base with better casters didn't work. So the only thing really left to change is the pole itself. I could just order a bigger extrusion with thicker material and a larger footprint, but I don't really want to wait on that. I'm not sure how long it would take. And then I would have to change the carriages and everything to match that. So I think I'm gonna try to double it up. So when I bought this extrusion, I bought a 4-pack. So I've got several long pieces that I can use. And I think all I need to do is actually bolt 2 of these together, and it will at least make it more rigid in one direction. But that means I'm gonna have to change a few things. Now there's 2 different ways I could orient these things, and either way they're gonna be bolted through so that they become stronger. I can either do it here, which is gonna push the 2 trolleys further away from each other, and that's fine. Or I could put it on the side, which is gonna make the entire thing wider from the perspective of the trolley. I think that's gonna be easier, but I honestly don't know which one's gonna be better. And since I don't know which one's gonna be better, I'm gonna pick the one that causes the fewest amount of changes. We're back down to just the pole, and before we actually do anything to it, I figure we need to get a baseline so you can see how much it moves on its own before I change it. That way you don't have to take my word for it. So right now, there is no weight on it. It's sitting on the base, which is sitting on the feet directly on the ground, and this is how much it moves. It's still moving just a little bit. Now granted, I did hit it pretty hard, but let's double it up and see if it's better. Okay, granted, this isn't bolting them together, but I am clamping 2 pieces together with 4 clamps just to see if it actually changes anything, because if this makes a little bit of a difference, then bolting them together should make more, theoretically. Let's try it. Okay, it stopped way faster, so I think we're on the right track. so it works as it should, but there's a little bit of frustrating irony. Remember earlier when I was talking about how now I don't have to have the kind of side brake thing that attaches on two sides because I didn't have stuff in the way? Well, now I have stuff in the way and I have to go back to using that brake. Luckily, it's just a matter of 3D printing another one because I modeled it in Fusion and I can print as many as I need. All right, it's the moment of truth. We've got to test the stands against each other to see if I've actually made any improvement in the wobbliness. I just want it to be better, even though I know that there's no way it's gonna be perfect. I need to prove that I've made some improvements. Now, the things I've done to try to make it better are double up the extrusion. I've added a different joint at the bottom. The base is a piece of steel and it's bolted down really tight, and I made the arm that the camera's sitting on a little bit shorter. So theoretically, it should at least be better, but we've got to actually try it out. This camera is on the original stand, and this camera is on the new stand. So I'm gonna smack these two the same amount, the same direction, and we'll see which one stops wobbling first. Ready? Here we go. This one's definitely better. It's already stopped. The wobbles were smaller to begin with, and this one's still going. Still going. Still going. It's better. Without a doubt, there's room for improvement, but also without a doubt, it's like objectively better. It stops wobbling a lot faster and the wobbles are much smaller or whatever, less noticeable. And this is a big improvement. Now I have one more big improvement to make to the entire thing before we call it done, but before we even get to that, I think there's a really obvious way to make the entire thing more stable next time. From what I can imagine, the absolute simplest way to make this thing better from the ground up would be to start with different extrusion. If you're gonna make one of these, don't start with 40-40 like I did. Start with something way bigger, like 80-80, or even bigger than that. But that's just the outside size of it. You have a lot of different options when it comes to that. There's also the thickness of the material. You can get this stuff thin-walled like this, and like what I'm using, or you can get it really thick-walled, and it's gonna be a lot more rigid. And honestly, if I was gonna do this again for a third time, which I'm not, I would probably just start with the piece of steel and then get some sort of a track like this, some sort of a uniform thing to mount to the outside of it. So the core is just gonna be more solid to begin with, and then you add on the stuff that you need. So if you're gonna make one, there are some tips that hopefully will help you have better results than even I had. Thicker material, better base, and you should be pretty good to go. But for me, I've only got a few more changes that I want to make to this just to kind of spice it up and make it a little bit better. One is the storage at the bottom, but the other one is actually simpler, but cooler, I think. One of the things I want for this setup is for both the monitor and the camera to be powered through USB from this battery backup. And so I've got a couple of cables that I can just kind of zip tie to the post, plug them in, and they'd be free or they'd be hidden, either way, except that they need to have some room to move. This camera has to be able to move all the way down into this position and all the way around, so those cables can't be too tight. But luckily, I modeled a few little pieces in Fusion and printed them out to make some really handy clips to put in the extrusion. Last time I told you about these captive nuts. These are awesome because you can put them in the end of the extrusion and then they're captive all the way through and you can screw stuff down into them, but they only come out through the ends. This is a different kind of captive nut, and the cool thing about it is that it doesn't have to go in from the end. You can drop it down in from the top, and then when it twists 90 degrees and gets tightened, it holds that way. So I just recreated that in Fusion, but instead of putting a screw hole in it, I put a post on the other end, and that means that I can stick stuff to it, like a little channel made for cables. So I can put these in any slot that I want, do a quarter twist, and then they're held in place. And I made a little tiny cover to hold the cables in place as well. I know I say it all the time, but being able to think of something and then 3D model it is an amazing feeling, or just to copy something that you already have and you need multiples of. Being able to 3D model is a fantastic skill, both for hobbies and for jobs. It can move careers along and just help you visualize projects easier. But modeling is hard, and that's why we made the Fusion for Makers online course, to teach people with zero experience how to model in Fusion. And that's whether you want to do stuff for 3D printing, or maybe you just want to build things in a wood shop, or you want to see what your kitchen's going to look like before you start tearing out walls. You can do all that stuff in Fusion and way more. It's also not one of those skills that is only for certain types of people. Anybody can learn this stuff, and I can prove it if you go over and check out the course. I'm gonna put a link down in the description, and it's gonna have a discount built into the link, so you get it automatically. Go down, click that link, and then go watch the free videos. See if it's something that's interesting to you, and if it is, I would love to hear what you think about the course, and I would love to see what you make after you learn how to use Fusion. Okay, so the last big thing that we need to do to this that we talked about at the beginning is improving the storage at the bottom. So we finally get to cut some plywood. Just like that, version 2 is done, and it's not perfect, but it's definitely way better. We had 3 things that I really wanted to improve, and all of those things are better than they were before. We've got a better base that's heavier, it's lower profile, it's on better casters, but they're retractable, so it'll sit right down on the ground and make the whole thing more stable. We've got removable storage that's not gonna fill up with sawdust. We have a counterweight that doesn't stick out and is not gonna run into the camera. And we have a double wide extrusion, which moves a lot less, at least in one direction. And then up top, we've got a little bit shorter arm, so it doesn't wobble this way as much. Plus, we've got a battery pack that can directly power the camera and the monitor and charge the microphones or whatever else we have up here. Like I said before, I do think the final solution would be to have a steel pole in the middle of this and actually add some tracks or some extrusion to the outside of it. That's just gonna make the whole thing a lot more rigid. But honestly, all of these little changes that I made, I think did add up to a major improvement. Sometimes I have the problem of thinking, how do I make this project a whole lot better? What is the big thing I could add to this to just make it really stand out? And I think honestly, you can make something a lot better by making a bunch of small things a little bit better. And that's exactly what I did here. None of these changes are groundbreaking, but they're adding up to making the whole thing more usable and just better. Anyway, thanks for hanging out with me while I try to improve something that was already doing pretty well. Hopefully you'll never see that camera stand do this. That's it for this one. Thanks for hanging out with me. I'll catch you next time. So, what is the problem? No, are the problems. But the problem is that anytime you make an adjustment with it, the first one is just the caster. First one is R. The first one is wobbliness. Wobble is the wobble. I didn't think ahead about how I wanted to say that.